Hello and welcome to the Counterweight podcast, where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. In this week's podcast, we speak with Amiel Handelsman. Amiel shares his ideas on how we can expand on diversity to find our commonalities. Trust me, it'll make sense. Join us to find out. Amiel Handelsman, it is great to see you again. Welcome this time to the Counterweight podcast instead of the Counterweight conference. And I wanted to invite you to the podcast because you had so many excellent ideas on how you do diversity and how you do it differently that I didn't feel like I got enough from the conference. So I wanted to invite you here again to speak a little bit about that. And let me just start off by saying one of the things that struck me about your approach to diversity was that you really took the individual as the first step to moving into this greater world of interpersonal, interactional relationships. And you talked about things like learning your values and stuff like that. And I feel like that is it. I feel like that's it. I feel like that's where that understanding of ourselves, that know thyself, if you will, is something we jump into this world of how we interact without even having that fundamental idea of ourselves. So I'm going to stop there. And I would love if you want to give a little introduction for those who might not have seen the conference on the work that you do and on yourself. But I'd love then for you to kind of start there on what you think is the most important thing when we discuss diversity today.
Well, first, Jen, thank you for having me on the Counterweight podcast. It's great to be here and continuing our conversation from that conference and also extending it in new ways. So you asked about my background. I've been working as an executive coach and leadership development professional, I guess is the word you're supposed to use, for 25 years, and working with big companies, public sector agencies, foundations, academic health centers, universities, some of them that have been in the news around topics that Counterweight discusses. And a lot of that work has been, for me over the years, has been learning to appreciate the uniqueness of each person for its own sake, and also to customize learning for each person. Very important in one-on-one executive coaching. There's no one size fits all. And we learn people's history, backgrounds, personality styles. I could go on. There are so many ways to define a person, so many dimensions to a person. So that has been my core work for, as I said, a couple of decades. And a fair amount of it, particularly the last 4 or 5 years, has actually been coaching people who you might refer to as underrepresented or kind of cutting against the grain inside big companies. And also, recently, I have been working with Greg Thomas of the Jazz Leadership Project and Jewel Kinch Thomas and others on what the Jazz Leadership Project calls diversity, maturity, and inclusion. I'm not going to attempt to fully represent that because a big part of it are the principles of jazz that Greg speaks better to. And I should have mentioned Mark Palmer as well, who was part of the conference. But many of the things that I'll talk about will be, what's the term we use? Adjacent. Diversity, maturity, and inclusion adjacent. In a good way. In a good way. In the geometry sense.
Well, then, tell us more. Go for it.
Where would you like to focus? Yeah, I kind of left you speechless.
Yeah,
there,
I was like, yeah.
I get it.
I'll tell you too, we actually we just did a podcast also with Greg, not really on the Jazz Leadership Project, but more on his work now with Carlos Hoyt and Sheena Mason on the census, which I'm sure that you're familiar with as well, which I love this idea of speaking to people who I feel are taking these conversations beyond just lip service to actually acting in ways that I think that we can really make a difference. And that's one of the things that I know that you're doing. So I think, where to start is really, tell us a little bit about how you got into this. Move us. I know that you do more than just diversity. I know that you do executive coaching and leadership coaching. But tell us how you got into the diversity and what that means to you and how you pursue it that might be in a way different than, say, mainstream DEI, and whether that's, your overlap with Greg and Mark or, some of the stuff that you do on your own. I'd love to kind of just hear more about that.
Sure. I'll give the more recent story because the longer story goes all the way back to college. And many of the conversations we're having now around this topic, I remember having 30 years ago in different ways. So I won't go into that whole story, but I will, share with you the last several years. And perhaps one thing to mention is that in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, Greg and Jewel Kinch Thomas and I realized that there were a lot of folks of, call it goodwill, making sense of that and looking for a more nuanced approach than perhaps they were hearing in the work of Ibram X. Kendi, Robin DiAngelo, and many people who followed their work. So folks who were, committed to combating racism, which still exists, and committed to exploring American history in its fullness, which is important, and realizing that a reductionist approach that puts people in rigid categories based on things they have no control over, and that pits different groups against each other might not be what the moment calls for. And so we created a course, 6-month course, to explore these together. And this was not for a company or organization. It was a public course and exposed folks to many different readers and thinkers, some of whom we agreed with, some of whom we saw things differently with, and had them do what I sometimes call the true but partial challenge, which is you might read something by a James Baldwin from 50 years ago and say, what's true and useful about this? And then, what's missing? What would you supplement this with? And it's a basic premise of that each of these teachers and thought patterns, there's something in there that's valuable, at least a positive intention. Sometimes we have to stretch harder for it than others. And there's often something that's missing. And so, so while that was happening, while we were teaching that course, I also wrote a 2-part article about White Fragility, the book. The first part of it was about what was true and useful about the book. And the second part of it was called Supplementing White Fragility. And I think I had 10 perspectives that were missing from the book. But the way I framed it is, if she were to embrace these perspectives, it would make it a more useful piece of work. Now, I have to confess, Jen, that I started writing the second part for the first, and the first part was hard to write. And yet, it was a good practice for me to stretch myself to appreciate some of the positive intention in there, particularly because I have many, many friends and colleagues who have followed her or admired her work. And I wanted to at least acknowledge, even if it's a small piece of it, to acknowledge that. In any case, doing some writing about that, doing this course with Greg and Jewel, and really, having a conversation about how we can serve organizations. So that's where the diversity, maturity, and inclusion work comes in.
You just said something that I just really resonates with me. During the whole George Floyd thing, there was a lot of 21-day racial reading guides that you might remember. Yeah. And my co-author and I, we created we called it a supplemental alternative 21-day reading guide. And so it took everything. We took the American Bar Association's one. There were several, but that one seemed to be pretty predominant. We took that and we put it side by side. It kept it wholesale, but then put side by side, if you're going to read this, read that instead. And so I love the fact that you just said that you read Robin DiAngelo, and that you wrote, okay, here's this, here's the good, here's some other things to think about. And I think that that's one of the problems that we have is, there's several problems, all wrapped up in there. People are criticizing things, first of all, without even knowing what they're criticizing. They see the vitriol around white fragility, and they just, they write it off without really even reading that. And I mean, I know that that's challenging to do, to sit down and read something that, most likely you might not really enjoy. But in order to really think critically about these, and to actually then have a conversation that could change minds.
Yeah.
You have to know what the arguments that you're arguing against are. And I think we've stopped short in this. I mean, first of all, we don't have a lot of time. With social media and just busy lives in general, I mean, we take a lot of shortcuts out of necessity often. So the fact that you did that, and I have to tell you, I haven't seen that article that you have. So I would love to, if it's for public consumption, if you'll send it to me, I'll make sure that's in the show notes.
Yeah, I'm happy to share it with you. And I just removed the paywall on Medium. I still use Medium, at least for now, for that 2-part article. I think what you say is really important about the value of reading or listening to something before critiquing it. And to that, I would add something you probably agree with, which is read or listen to it before you promote it. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. Some friends of ours I shared my white fragility piece with, they pulled out a couple pieces from the article, the second part, and said, we know her, we work with her, we've been in a lot of events with her. This doesn't sound like her. What makes you think that she pulls women out of the room after they're crying? And I just had to simply say, I read it in her book, So I do think that is important for all of us who want to have skillful, constructive conversations to read and listen to each other. We can't do it all. But maybe the stronger we feel about something and the stronger we advocate for it might create a responsibility to understand it fairly well. And I want to just make another point about what makes this really important to me is sometimes you'll have people say that anti-racism or diversity and inclusion, quote, goes too far, right? And what they mean is it can become very rigid. So by the standards of pushing people into things dogmatically, yes, you could say that it goes too far. From another perspective, mine, I don't think it goes far enough. I don't think it goes far enough in creating positive results. For example, if our goal is, just to take one part of the puzzle, to have more high school students understand the fullness of American history, I think it's absolutely essential that we understand about slavery, Reconstruction, the end of Reconstruction, the Ku Klux Klan, and so on. And I think it's important that we understand that in the context of the rest of American history And then we also understand the chronology of history. And then we also understand that that doesn't define the United States fully. It's part of it. And so doing all of those things makes it more likely that more high school students will actually go, wow, this is something for me to be aware of and to take seriously, but they're not feeling like they are personally being under attack, that they're being told that they're responsible. Because once you put the ideological straitjacket onto people, it shuts them down. And so if the goal is for people to open up, to grow, to learn, to come together, we're not going far enough. And I think you could say the same about the newest versions of diversity and inclusion, which also, I would say, by that same standard, could go a lot further.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that makes me think of something else, too, with regards to particularly younger kids and students, which I feel that we've failed them in more than just this world of diversity and inclusion, critical thinking. And part of that is, taking different works and exploring them and researching them and having those discussions. And lately, I think we a lot of times shut down a lot of conversation, which does a disservice then to our education system and our ability to raise citizens who are able to really, move us to a better place.
Yeah, well, particularly, again, it's really important to distinguish age groups. And we're talking sort of about middle school or high school right now, different from people in their 30s or 40s or beyond. That from a field called constructivist adult development or developmental psychology, it looks at the growth of teenagers and then into adulthood. We know that from the ages of, say, 13 to 20, kids are going through a particular developmental stage where they're learning to internalize, take seriously, make part of themselves other people's perspectives. A 10-year-old cannot do that. You may think that they're doing something because they agree with you, like taking out the trash, right? Or going to bed on time. But they're doing it because they're calculating the consequences. They don't want you to get mad at them. They don't want to lose their allowance. Whatever the case may be, they want to keep their screen time. 10-year-olds are doing that. Parents want kids to do it because to internalize the parents' feelings. So anyways, that's this transition. That's quite a 7, 8, 9 years where kids are learning to internalize things. So we're catching them right in the middle of that transition. And there's a great opportunity to introduce American history and diversity in a way that's developmentally appropriate and that fosters kids' growth. And the good news is that when we do it in a developmentally appropriate way and foster kids' growth, they mature. They learn to take on more perspectives, put themselves in more people's shoes, and maybe even care about the people in whose shoes they're putting themselves. So if we're able to focus on what fosters growth and development in human beings, in this case, high school students, we're more likely to get the kind of citizenry that prompts all of this work. So again, I see a great opportunity, and I'm really not that interested in just like playing defense, if you know what I mean. And playing defense is in the sense of criticizing that things that go too far. Absolutely important to point it out. And I do that, right? Or defense is saying too much too fast because I want more growth, more learning, more critical thinking. And because it matters. And also, let me add one more thing here that's really related. There are so many big challenges in the world today. We don't often talk about this when we're talking about anti-racism and diversity and inclusion. We've got climate change. We have huge threats to liberal democracy. Talk about threats to critical thinking, that sure is one of them. The Russian invasion of Ukraine and genocide and attempted genocide is part of that. We have artificial intelligence what is going to happen with artificial intelligence? What is happening with it? These are huge, complex problems. We need to be supporting people in developing greater thinking skills, greater capacity to take perspectives, and to care about more people. And so that's what makes learning to get along together in the midst of diversity so important. It's not just for the sake of including excluded groups and making everyone feel welcome, although that's absolutely important. And sometimes those excluded groups are not the ones that you might think, right? And they may not be the ones you might think, and which is something I talked about in the conference talk. So we need to be able to work together amidst diversity, because as a collective, as a nation and our community and the planet, the challenges are awesome. So we need to do our best.
Yeah, you brought up something I hadn't really thought about, but I think that's so incredibly important, is like just the developmental stages, that we also need to tailor these various messages appropriately so that we get the most, bang for our buck with where kids are in their thought processes. I mean, I hadn't even thought, it makes sense, but it hadn't occurred to me. Oh yeah, like by 10 years old, they're not thinking about how they're interacting. They're doing something for a different reason. And I feel like there's such often, particularly with around issues like DEI, there's kind of this blanket application. Blanket application in so many ways. First and foremost, what we talked about a lot in the conference was more how it was, group us and racialized and essentialized us. But I think blanket application too, in a way that we haven't discussed, is how we use it to bring forth the best development of our kids, instead of just this one size fits all mode. Do you see that happening? With mainstream DEI being just thrown at, particularly we're talking now about kids, from from K through 12, where there's not this sense of how to approach the particular development of the age group that they're working with.
I think it's very hard to be a teacher if we're still talking about teachers. And I was just at an event with a principal and parents of a local high school, and just having enough teachers, keeping teachers is really challenging. So I just want to name the moment that we're in after the pandemic, wherever you want to place us. So it's very challenging to teach. So I want to name that teachers have challenges on their own development.
Right.
Teachers have challenges on their own development and need support. And in some places we do that better than others. This is not to praise or blame teachers. It's just to name the context in which they live. And to be able to understand what kids are going through this developmental perspective, I don't know how widely shared it is. I haven't done work as a coach and consultant with high schools. And my oldest of our two sons will be in high school next year. So you can ask me in a year or two what I know, because I really don't, and I haven't studied it. But my general familiarity is that, my general sense of things is that tuning into where anyone is developmentally is hard, particularly the older they get. When kids are small, the Piaget theories, people kind of get those, but as people start to look fully grown, we kind of think, well, the body has stopped growing. They're kind of adults. And that's completely wrong. We have amazing research from last 30 or 40 years in the field of adult development that shows that even as adults, we have the capacity to take on more perspectives and manage complexity more skillfully. So I think that, and this is one of the reasons I'm bringing this up, is just simply to draw attention to it. Robert Keegan, who's one of the pioneers in this at Harvard, has a book called In Over Our Heads. And what he means by that is that society creates a curriculum. He calls it a hidden curriculum for teens and for adults of how they want us to know the world, how they want us to understand, who they want us to be. Right? For kids, as I said, for high school students, It's, I want you to do things because I want them. I want you to be quiet in class and not be disrupted because I, the teacher, want it. Or as a parent, I want you to come back by your curfew or call us if you're not going to be able to, not just to avoid consequences, but because you agree with me. We want that, but kids haven't gotten there developmentally. So kids are in over their heads. And once we realize that, we go, I can't expect someone who's 5'3" to dunk a basketball. Getting frustrated at someone, why can't you dunk it? Why don't you jump higher? Get thicker shoes, whatever. Like, it doesn't work. You can't expect kids who are 12, 13, even 15 to do what a 30-year-old can do. But we forget that. Same thing is happening with adults. And then I'll stop here and see if you want to stay on this or go somewhere else. Adults, we're in a different transition. We've reached this stage of mind, which Keegan calls the socialized mind, where we can internalize other people's perspectives and care about them rather than just looking out for our own self-interest. Adults are going from there to being able to self-author their own experience. In other words, when we're in the socialized mind, if you have a view of how the world should be, and my dad has a view, and my wife has a view, and I care about all of them, I have this incredible inner tearing because I internalize your view, and then I internalize his view, and then I internalize her, and I'm just torn apart. I have no larger capacity in my brain to go, oh, here's how these all relate. I have a theory about how to make sense of all these. I'm subject to each, so I'm stuck, so I get stretched. That's why so many of us are like, oh my God, I feel so caught. I feel so divided. That's often what we mean. So we are in over our heads, including a lot of teachers, as adults. And so just to say, tie back to my work, a big part of my work working with executives and teams is helping them to understand the demands being placed on them in the workplace mostly, and to provide them the support to rise to the challenge. Because we need as much support as there is challenge. If we have more challenge than support, it's incredibly painful. If we have more support than challenge, we can get bored, you know?
Yeah, I kind of want to go there, but transition also to your work with leadership in general. This is really fascinating, though, to me. So my question to you, since this is something that you coach adults on, is how to manage different views. Give us a little preview of that. I think that's one of the biggest problems today in America is viewpoint diversity or lack thereof. We talk about diversity mostly when we're talking about like different skin color, but this viewpoint diversity, I think, is what's missing. So, and because it's missing, we don't know how to talk to people who are different from us, whether it's because they look different or they think differently.
Yes.
So how do you address those conflicting views and create leadership out of that? Because that is honestly, if we can do that, if we can manage that, that diversity to harness it is powerful, right?
Extraordinarily so. So step one is finding out our skin in the game. Finding out our skin in the game, which means I'm not doing this. I'm not learning about diversity and viewpoint diversity because somebody required me to. I'm not even doing it just because I want to be a good person. Although being a good person is, I find, commendable. Those motivations only keep us in the game for so long. So one of the important jobs of someone like me is to help managers and executives realize how the things that they care about will be served by embracing diversity and inclusion at their best. And what people care about varies greatly. And I just want to say that is so important because doing this work is challenging. It's complex. It involves lots of practicing. I think we don't just think about it and have an aha. We practice learning how to work with diversity, including viewpoint diversity. And we know from the field of deliberate practice in sports, music, and the performing arts, you have to be ignited to practice. You're not going to just practice playing tennis for the heck of it. But maybe one day you saw this amazing tennis player and you go, I want to be like her. And suddenly you're practicing every day. So the same thing is true in organizations, is that we get better at diversity through practices. In my case, it's helping people with conversational skills practices and sort of inner reflection practices. But to do that, you've got to have a big why. Why does this matter to me? And once people have a why, then so many other things become possible. So I can say more about what those things are, but that's the first step that a lot of folks skip. And also why it becomes very hard for what I would call unhealthy diversity and inclusion to truly engage people, because they're not assuming that that person has much of a why. They're telling them the why.
I would love for you to go more, because that kind of brings us back to where I started. And my fascination of your work is, you really start at the root of who we are. What are our values? I mean, a lot of times, even as adults, that seems like most people should be able to just name that off. My values are this, my virtues are this, my why is this. But those are really deep questions that a lot of us don't have answers for. And even where we do, they change often.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, yes, I would love to hear a little bit more about that work, because I do feel, like I mentioned at the beginning, that's what's missing from a lot of the diversity work, is the work that we need to do on ourselves before we can even engage in larger community.
Right. So there are 3 words I'll introduce that I like to use with leaders and teams to understand what's important to them, right? To understand how they have skin in the game. Commitments, immediate concerns, and future possibilities. This is sort of a way to break down what matters to someone into 3 categories. So a commitment is something that you can tell someone has based on their experiences, right? So you can tell that I have a commitment to understanding somebody's ideas before I spout off about them. Sometimes too much. Sometimes I do that to an excess. And you can see that I care about my kids' development. For a manager, I have a lot of clients who they say, I want to be known as a manager of choice. Sometimes this is because they've had great managers that they admire. Sometimes it's because they haven't been that good. And and that feels like a breakdown for them. They've had employees leave, right? They have a low retention rate. And so for a variety of reasons, not just to keep their job and do well in business, but just for their own sense of integrity and who they are, they chose to go into managing as a field. They want to be a good manager. So that's an example of a commitment, right? Another commitment, thinking of someone else I've worked with, who had a great commitment to what he called work-life balance and became quite a spokesperson in a company of over 100,000 people for how to help people in a very intense high-tech environment experience full parts of their lives, not just be fully. So that's something. So if you look at each of these commitments, there is a way to find out how diversity can help that, right? So that's commitments. Immediate concerns are what's in a person's face right now. What's in their face right now? And that could include, say, they just got a promotion and they're with a whole new group of people, or they have a whole new set of responsibilities, like, whoa. That person will probably find that being good at diversity would be useful for them, and inclusion will be useful for them. Or maybe they recently had a health scare and had them realize maybe they were treated really beautifully by nurses in the hospital, and they realized, gosh, I don't treat people like that. And so there's this sort of immediate concern that's that has happened in their life, and they still perhaps still have a life skill. I've worked with people like this. So there's a lot of immediate concerns, and sort of the metaphor for that, just to go back into the world of movies for a while, is the movie Alien, where the alien gets stuck on the guy's face, and you can't do anything until you remove it from its face. Now, where that metaphor goes awry is that even when you remove it from its face, other bad stuff can happen I won't get into, but everybody remembers who's over maybe 40. But an immediate concern is like right there, it's happening right there. And that can cause a person to get curious about these things. I think commitments are a better skin in the game. And then there's future possibilities where you may not have any demonstration that you care about something, but you go, aha, in the future, that matters to me. Right? That matters to me. Maybe it's in the future, I want my kids to look up to me and go, you know, my mom, say I'm a woman, my mom did some really good things for the planet. Because maybe my kids are aware of climate change and she did something really good for the planet. And that's a possible, and I haven't done anything about that lately. Lately meaning, you know, the last 30 to 50 years in this example. And so that's like a future possibility. So sometimes finding out what's important to people is actually, there's no evidence that they've done anything about it, but it's something they see when they look out into the future. And then once they name it, that then can give them some skin in the game for growing as a person. Does that help a little bit? Is that where you're aiming for, or is there more?
Yeah. That, and also, how do you, when you're dealing with the people that you're dealing with in the various spaces where you do, how do you talk a lot about like values and understanding? I think we talked a little bit about what is the drama triangle?
Drama triangle, the drama triangle.
And I felt like these are all really important tools that a lot of people are unfamiliar with. So how do you use those tools to familiarize people, but then to bring them into a better place where diversity can flourish?
Great. Did you want me to say more about how I use them, or say more about that particular tool, that approach? What was it be most interesting?
Both and.
Both and, okay.
Yeah.
So one thing that's interesting about the drama triangle, and I'm reading, just to promote our friend David's book, Woke Anti-Semitism, he has an example of a different model. And both of these approaches to organizations look at how power works. Mm-hmm. It was interesting. As soon as I say how power works in organizations, if you've seen how extreme the, let's call it postmodern progressive ideology at its extreme can go, they say that everything is about power, and you can correlate a person's power based on some superficial characteristic. So it's about power. When I say power, I'm talking about understanding how power dynamics work in organizations psychologically, politically, but you're not automatically in a group because you're, white or black or man or woman or gay or whatever, right? But I just wanted to put it in context that the drama triangle is a way to look at what's happening in organizations and how power dynamics get created. Not for the sake of reinforcing those dynamics, right? So when there's the discussion of oppressor and oppressed, the idea is one group is the group is the oppressor, the other group is the oppressed, and they're always going to stay that way, and we need to point that out. In the drama triangle, we say there are these three roles, and we'd like people to grow out of them. Mm-hmm. Notice the difference. We'd like them to grow out of them. So you've got the victim, the persecutor, and the rescuer. Victim and the persecutor, you could say, are a bit like the oppressed and the oppressor. Mm-hmm. Somewhat similar. But then you add in the rescuer. And so the idea is that we catch ourselves and other people in these roles. And by catching ourselves in the roles, we go, oh, I don't want to be doing that anymore. Like, oh, I'm going into my victimhood. Or, boy, I'm really persecuting someone. Or there I go rescuing again. Because I begin to see, when I learn about the drama triangle, I understand there's a downside to this. We name the dynamic so we know there's a downside to it. And so just, very commonly in in the last 5 or 7 years with Black Lives Matters, the murder of George Floyd, and so on, I notice a lot of white identified people who have become rescuers. And it's a mix of good intention, shame, and other dynamics, the rescuer dynamics. And it's basically, this horrible thing happened. I feel terrible about it. I need to go in and do something different. I'm going to go rescue the victim. And so if you look at so many of the stories that you and I are familiar with, where people in organizations have gotten canceled, fired, shamed publicly, that person is considered the persecutor. There's a victim in the story, but there's always a rescuer. And as I was saying, a lot of white identified people have become rescuers. However, this dynamic is not particularly healthy. It's not particularly healthy for any of us. And the irony is that in the drama triangle theory, and also in the last 5 years, rescuers often become victims. So this is the example of, I'm bending myself, I'm molding myself, I'm trying to fit in, I want to be friends with my progressive friends, if that's where you are. And then you end up getting struck down the most, right? So you think you're doing a noble thing, and the next thing you know, you've been, pushed out of the room. So in any case, this example, this drama triangle is a way to understand the ways that human beings psychologically, interpersonally can interact so that we can lift ourselves out of it. And the path out of that, again, I'll say it again, is a process of growth and development. It's by making that dynamic an object in awareness rather than being subject to it. If we're subject to something, we can't see it. It's like, I got these glasses on, this is how the world is. And then I go, oh, these glasses were creating the world as it is. Now I see things a little bit differently. And that's the purpose of the drama triangle, is to be able to see the dynamics differently so that we can free ourselves from them, so we can do the work that we're here to do for the organization. Mm-hmm. We're here to do work for the organization. We're not, we join an organization for a job, for a paycheck, for camaraderie. Hopefully, if we're lucky enough, we care about the purpose. So let's get on to the purpose of the organization and use diversity and inclusion to enhance that purpose rather than to detract from it. So
I've got, I love the idea of growing out of something. So I heard that. And for some people might not be familiar with the drama triangle, but we all play our roles several times. Yeah. And we change roles depending on, but one of the things you said was part of growing out of it, if I heard you correctly, was obviously just recognizing it.
Yeah.
Right. But what would you say? I mean, you've got your victims, the persecutors, the rescuers. I mean, is there ever a time that we need to play any of those roles? And, or if not, if the answer is no, how do we grow out of it? What are other roles that we can play? Because there are going to be times where someone, you might need to stand up and help someone. How do you play it in a way that you aren't part of the drama triangle anymore, that you're not the rescuer in the drama triangle, but you're part of a healthier solution? What are some of the alternatives?
Yeah, I mean, there's some people who've written on this, but let me just give a simple answer to that, because some of my other answers have been long-winded, which is that once we are out of a dynamic with pre-described roles, right? We no longer have pre-described roles, which have then pre-described actions. Then we can meet the moment anew and say, what's happening here? What's the situation I'm in? Can I make some grounded assessments of what's going on here? And can I consider what my own strengths are and what I care about? And now what am I to do? It individuates the decision rather than falling into habit. So in the case of, I was recently reading an article about someone at one of the big museums, I think it was in New York City, who got pushed out of a role. I think it was in the Atlantic. So if you're an administrator in an organization where somebody is getting attacked and you don't fall into, say, the rescuer role, rescuing the supposed victim, and you go, what's actually happening here? I mean, it's so basic, but it's slowing down the feeding frenzy, right? And saying, I want to make a grounded assessment of the situation. Let me take in different perspectives. And see what are some skillful means I can apply to the situation. I mean, this happens in parenting all the time. As a parent, I can be the victim, the persecutor, and the rescuer, depending upon the day.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just make it very personal. So occasionally, my kids accuse me of things. When they accuse me of things, I can feel like the victim, right? And then I can do whatever it is I do as a victim, which is cower or lash back or run away or blame them or whatever it is. Or I can go, ouch, that hurts. So you say, what's happening right now? That hurts. And then as an adult, I can go, oh, what has you thinking that? Tell me more. And so I've learned as a parent to almost kind of humor myself and be like, oh, okay, so you think that I'm being such and such. Tell me more of the story.
Mm.
So because I'm not stuck in a reactive mode, I'm able to be just a little bit more spacious so I can inquire and learn.
I love that. It's that you're not reacting. I think that's it, the reactive mode. I think the way to get out of it is A, to be aware of it, and then B, and this goes back kind of to the idea of like slowing down and actually just asking questions and thinking critically.
Yeah, and also knowing my predispositions for certain modes. So victim, persecutor, rescuer is one. I think we had talked about the Enneagram, which we won't try and cover, but it's a personality style, right. I'll call it transformative instrument. And so I might know that I have a predisposition to, let's just say, feeling a sense of distrust, maybe worrying, maybe having a lot of future anxiety about future scenarios. And if I'm able to catch myself acting based upon that and then create a pause between what happens and my action, that creates freedom. Mm-hmm. Who doesn't want more freedom in their life? Degrees of freedom. There's political freedom, there's economic freedom. There's also just freedom in the moment in our responses. And so families or in organizations, as you said, slowing down, taking a breath, probably catching ourselves saying, oh, look what I'm doing there. I'm going into catastrophizing again. Or gosh, I'm sort of playing the victim here. Not to berate ourselves, right? Not to shame ourselves, which has its own work around, but to go, wow, look at that's happening. If I can do that from kind of a neutral perspective, it's almost like there's this person over here, this Amiel over here. Look at that. It's like going to the balcony. They say you instead of like being on the stage, you go around, you go up to the balcony, you look down at yourself on the stage. You feel a sense of distance. And it's like, look at that guy, Amiel, over there, catastrophizing. Suddenly, I have a little bit more distance from it. I feel a little more free to do something different. And, it's wonderful when I see in teams, maybe it's one by one, but people gradually be able to slow themselves down and to see each other as they are rather than through these filters and free themselves from those pre-described roles. It's a beautiful thing to see when it happens.
Yes. And again, this is, again, to go back to where I started, this is what attracted me so much to your solutions to dealing with diversity is I love the psychology behind it. I love the Enneagram. I love learning about the drama triangle and the roles we play in it, all the personality assessments and whatnot. And I really feel like until we can't put that pause that you said, we can't really tell ourselves to pause until we know where these triggers, if you were, are coming from. And in order to know that, we have to know ourselves. And so again, I find your approach to leadership and also diversity at that elemental stage so key and so fundamental that it kind of blew me away. And that's why, so much of the mainstream diversity that we say, it imbues these like group identities and locks you in place and kind of freezes you in time, versus I think your approach, which is let's figure out about ourselves first. Let's tackle that.
Yeah, I love that. And that phrase, freezes in time.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great phrase. We freeze people in time based on their group. We don't have to. One other thing I really want to emphasize, in addition to individualizing and understanding individuals' experience, is also finding commonality or sameness.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that good, constructive work around difference happens when the people doing the work already have discovered something in common. They could have same thing as commitments, immediate concerns, possibilities. Mm-hmm. They could have both grown up in small rural towns with one building for K through 12. They could both have, 13-year-old twin boys, right? They could both be have worked at a particular organization 30 years ago or gone to the same high school. So this is another area where we could be going further in diversity and inclusion and anti-racism work towards our goals. And it's a bit, what's the word I'm trying to think of here? Counterintuitive, is that to do diversity better, we start by looking at what we have in common. Now, I'm not saying stopping there.
Right.
Everyone's the same, we're all one, we're all the same. No, but there is a partial truth in that, which is with every other person, we have something in common. And so it's nice with teams and in workshops to be able to help people find, and this is part of the diversity, maturity, and inclusion work with Jazz Leadership Project I mentioned earlier, is taking time to find out what you have in common, what's similar with you and another person. Because what does that allow? Then when you start to explore differences, number one, you have some mutual trust, right? Number two, just in your brain, you have a sense of sameness, which activates a certain part of the brain, right? And third, notice how hard it is to say us versus them when I've already established my commonality with another person. Now, here's the catch, Jen. I just want to add, this is the icing on the cake, is that, and I came to this realization, I'm sure it's not mine, but I came to the realization in a conversation I had with Greg Thomas and Mark Palmer a few months ago, right before the Counterweight conference, which is that to find commonality, we are more likely to find areas of commonality if we can increase the number of categories of difference that we have. If the only example of difference we have is skin color or religion, it's harder to find it. But all those things I mentioned before, Enneagram is, we have the same personality type. Kids are the same age. We have the same, we wear the same glasses brand, which I've never thought of, but it just occurred to me, and so on. So this is another reason why it's so important in diversity to go be, as Roosevelt Thomas Jr., the great diversity pioneer, said 30 years ago, his title of his book was Beyond Race and Gender. Greg and I both mentioned this in our conference presentation. Go beyond race and gender. It's not to exclude those things, although I don't actually believe in race, as you know. But it's not to exclude them, but it's like we need to look at all these various forms of diversity so that we can, number one, find commonality so that we have a solid foundation upon which to do diversity work. And then the second reason is that those forms of diversity can create tension between us. If we're similar to someone because we both have, what did I say, 12-year-old, let's make it twin daughters. Well, let's make it triplets. We have 12-year-old triplet daughters because that sounds really hard.
Oh my gosh, I was going to say no, thank you. But okay, go on with your analogy.
Yeah. Talking about in over your heads. So if you discover you both have that, then you have commonality. But if you acknowledge a new category of difference and realize that you're different, like maybe you have a different functional area. I'm in marketing, you're in engineering. A lot of tensions between marketing and engineering. Those are tensions we need to work through to be a successful company. If we leave those on the table, we lose a tremendous amount of opportunities. And also, some, but not all, conflict that we attribute to somebody's biological sex or the color of their skin, some of it can be attributed to all sorts of other things, including like functional differences. Like, oh gosh, those engineers, that person isn't paying any attention to what our customers need. It must be because I'm yellow, brown, black, a woman, gay. Well, maybe. Or maybe it's because a lot of engineers aren't that tuned into the customer. Good ones are. So I've said a lot there, but the bottom line is that like learning how we are in common can be so, so useful.
Okay, but the mic drop of what you just said.
What's the mic drop, Jen?
The mic drop for me, and I'm paraphrasing it, but when we expand on our various forms of diversity, we find our commonality.
Yes.
And I love it. I love like I feel like if we did diversity training where it was like, we did Enneagrams, we did Briggs-Meyer, and be like, oh, you're a 3 and you're an INF, whatever. And to see how many ways that we are different to bring in these larger parameters for commonality. I don't know. I might not be saying that was my...
It's great. Absolutely. How we're different and all the ways we're different and all the ways we're similar.
Yes. But it's by expanding diversity that we find our commonalities. Yeah. Expanding the definitions of diversity, expanding the ways that we're diverse, we find more ways that we're in common.
Right. And I would contend that has two benefits. One benefit is it makes it more likely that we're going to have effective teams, thriving organizations, if that's what's most important. But also, and this is sort of the interesting byproduct, is I also think it's more likely that we're going to learn to get along together across some of the more talked about types of diversity.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm glad we got to a mic drop, Jen. That's good about that.
Yeah, I was trying. I mean, because it sounds counterintuitive, right? So I was trying to put it together in my brain, and then the way you did it, I was like, "That's it. That's it."
And it's not racial bypassing, gender bypassing, sexual orientation. It's not eliminating that. It's adding to it.
It's adding to it.
Yeah. And I appreciate your. I have a little gnat there. Appreciating your inviting me to do this, and one thing I hope, this isn't why maybe I started this, but I hope there are people who look like me with my color skin and who are men who feel very uncomfortable being public about this. And in many cases, it's risky. It really is. You could lose your job, you could lose your friends, and so on. But I realize that, I hope that by having this conversation, and maybe it helps some folks feel a little bit more free to think differently, have new conversations about this, at least with trusted parties. Because when we're having good, respectful conversations with each other, that's a really good thing. That is a really good thing. So I'm so grateful for that, Jen.
Yeah, well, I'm grateful for you, Amiel. Thank you for spending the time with me again.